Today we will be studying about socket programming. Socket programming is basically an interprocess communication technique that works over a network. Socket programming is used to connect a client and server and exchange information between them. There are two kinds of sockets that can be used. There is something called a TCP socket and a UDP socket. Today we will be focusing on TCP sockets. UDP sockets we will study in the further labs. So to set up a TCP socket, on the server side first we have to include a set of header files. Now this particular client server application that we are considering is going to basically exchange time. In the sense, the client is going to send a request to the server for the time of the day, and the server will reply with the time of the day, and that time is printed on the client. This is the overall functionality. Now, on the server side there will be a bunch of header files, and then we will also have time.h so that time related information can be transmitted. Now we know that the first thing that we have to do when we are going to use socket programming is to create the socket. Now for that we are going to use two socket descriptors and one server address socket structure. Now this server address socket structure is going to be used later on, but first we create a socket and we assign one of the socket descriptors to it. Once we've created the socket, please note that in the socket our argument is sock stream, which means that we are going to be dealing with TCP sockets. Now once the socket is created, it has to be bound with a specified port number. In this case the port number that we are considering is 5000. Now this port number is assigned in this server address structure. Now once that assignment is complete here, we can bind this socket descriptor with this port number, and that is what we are doing here. Once the bind is complete, it is just listening for incoming connections. When we get an incoming connection, the incoming connection is accepted, and then time is basically read from the system and stored in ticks, and then ticks is basically written to the client. If you note, this writing is happening over a socket descriptor called confd. Confd is the socket descriptor into which we have accepted the incoming connection. So basically you accept the incoming connection and then you transmit the time and date to the client, and after that you are just closing confd and sleeping, right? Now if you look at what is happening on the client side we need two things majorly. We need a socket to be created, and then we need to know what the IP address and the port number of the server is so that we can connect to it. So the header files are pretty much the same. We are going to use one socket descriptor, one buffer to store incoming data and print it. Now because we are using the same system for both the client and the server, our server side IP address will be local loopback 127.0.0.1, and here in this program we have configured it such that that IP address will be entered at the command line. So that is what this is doing here. So this is checking for the IP address to be entered at the command line. Once we've done that part of it, we can go ahead and create our socket. So we are creating a socket. Once we've created the socket, we can connect to the server. Now connecting to the server will involve the same port number on which the server is listening and the IP address of the server, which is nothing but the command line argument that is coming when we execute the program. We'll see that in a minute. Now, once we have those two informations, we can connect to the server. If the connection is successful, we can read the data from the server and then we print it out on the client. So if we take a look at how this is supposed to be executed, you have to open one terminal for the server, compile the server. The name I am giving for the compiled file is serve. So I compile the server and then I run the executable serv. Now this server is basically listening for incoming connections. On the client side, I am going to compile the client and then I am going to run the executable .cli followed by the IP address of the server to which it is expected to connect to. So in this case, that is 127.0.0.1 because the server is running on the same machine. So if we run this, we should see the date and the time that has been returned from the server. So this is the date and the time that has been returned from the server itself. This is basically how we can demonstrate the usage of a TCP based socket connection. In future labs, you will also study how UDP can be used in socket programming and the differences that it has with how TCP sockets work. Thank you.